So this is probably going to be even more controversial question here I'm going to ask you, which is that, we have this sense that we're in a transition period. I think you probably have the same feeling that in some ways the modern world, whatever that is, whether it's from the time of the Enlightenment, whether it's more like the 19th century, there's a sense in which this way that we've been writing is reaching its end. Things are kind of fragmenting, falling apart. It's related to technology and all these kinds of things. As you know, Roger talks about reenchantment and this kind of collapse, or this like return of certain types of influences on our reality. And so one of the things that we've noticed, and that I've noticed as someone who's interested in traditional Christianity and the church fathers and in that worldview, is that our curriculum is highly Enlightenment, lopsided towards the Enlightenment. And the way that we understand what is a classic book usually starts around at the 17th century, although we have a few things before. And so, so we've been doing this universal history episodes on symbolic world, trying in some ways to recover some of these texts, like the Voyage of St. Brendan, or if you think of the apocalypse of Pseudo-Methodius, that in the Middle Ages were so important, right? That had a huge, or the Golden Legend, let's say in the West, these kinds of texts. And so I guess my question is, do you feel like our canon is going to change, that the different emphases that we're going to have, or that we should have, is going to change as we move forward and we kind of move out of this Enlightenment, the dominant Enlightenment thinking?
Yeah. Well, I've been thinking a lot about the novel as a form.
Yeah, that's a good example here.
As a technology. And it's kind of a remarkable and novel, thing. It kind of shows up. And you can trace the history of the novel. A lot of people will trace it back to Quixote. And that's fair. But there's this strange intimacy that a novel affects that has been good, but I think we've under-indexed the bad of that. And I love novels, but and I know everything before the but is a problem, but like, for instance, I think of something like Pride and Prejudice, and I love, might make me a weirdo, but I love Jane Austen novels. And, something like Pride and Prejudice is kind of a miracle, in terms of her ability to show us how thinking happens, how feeling happens. I mean, it's a pretty extraordinary thing. Something like Dante, not a novel, has these little moments where he kind of, peers through the page a little bit and then kind of quickly goes back into it. So it's not like it's an unprecedented thing. But Shakespeare gives us some insights into that, when you just have a character on stage and there's a soliloquy. Milton's portrayal of Lucifer has sort of these similar moments where you have this sort of strange moment where you're like, man, I feel and think exactly that. So I don't mean to denigrate the power of the novel, but the novel also gives us a kind of fake intimacy, that or it can, that compels a kind of inward turn that I fear can end in a kind of solipsism. And I think the novel has sort of done its trick. I'm not arguing that the novel's over, and I'm not arguing that you can't go and read a novel and get some amazing things out of it, but I don't think it's entirely where we need to go.
Yeah.
Right. It seems to me that the novel, that maybe you could trace sort of intellectual currents that maybe modernism or the Enlightenment, or maybe that's coterminous with the novel. So rather than tracing it to Descartes that people like to do, which is fair, that's
Yeah.
one way to trace it. That's one way to make this little sketch. I mean, maybe it is the novel, and maybe the sort of because what's so weird in a novel, even more so than Paradise Lost, is that it can make you inhabit, you know, a terrible person.
Yeah.
In a way that even Paradise Lost, compelling you to sort of get into Satan's headspace, um, still affects a kind of distance in a way that a novel doesn't. And I'm not, and these are off, I'm just kind of riffing
Yeah.
here. I've been thinking through this quite a bit, but I think there's a reason why the 20th century has this incredible flowering of the novel. I spent a ton of time reading, Faulkner as an undergrad, and I love Faulkner, but I don't know if Faulkner works for my, like, I don't, I haven't tried to teach, Faulkner in a long time. And I wonder if it would work at all in some strange
Well, I'll
way.
tell you the truth. I never read Faulkner. I'm also
Yeah.
from the French world, by the way, which people
Yeah.
have to remember.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I actually just a few weeks ago uh, started to try to read Faulkner,
Hmm.
and I just in this world,
Hmm.
I would say that I felt like he was demanding too much of me that I wasn't
Hmm.
willing to give him.
Yeah.
That I wasn't willing to, that he was demanding a lot of me, and I just didn't have the energy it's
Yeah.
like it's almost have to base it on trust, right? It's like
Yeah.
people are telling me this is amazing,
Hmm.
and so dive into it. And so
Hmm.
I'm seeing all these multiple perspectives and these kind of
Hmm.
emotional, autobiographical ways of speaking. And I'm like, you know what? I don't care.
Yeah, no, it's funny. No, to argue for Faulkner just for a second, I think he's deeply mythological. Interestingly enough, and of course the mythos that he's wrestling with is the inheritance of a destroyed people,
Hmm.
right? As a white Southerner,
Yeah.
so I think if we can frame it. If you could frame it like that, again, I get the lift. I believe me, I hear you. Um, but if you could frame it in that kind of deeper, I mean, it's very Greek actually,
Hmm.
in terms of the sort of the haunted house and
Yeah.
the house of Atreus, and he's really working those things, but it's so deeply sublimated into what for most of us has become almost entirely esoteric. Right. Whereas for him, he's working through a deeply exoteric tradition that again sits on top of a presupposition of knowing all of the references.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, there may be a time, I could foresee a time that Faulkner has a kind of renaissance in 300 years. I don't know, but are we here in 2026 at a point where Faulkner just doesn't connect? That's a
Yeah.
good
Yeah.
question, and it pains me to say it out loud because I love Faulkner, but the novel itself presupposes a depth and a familiarity with the tradition. It's like jazz. I marvel at these sort of mid-century achievements. American jazz, and you know, it is astounding to me that there was a sizable, I hate to use the word market for jazz
Yeah.
in the mid-century. It's such a taxing form, both for the musicians and the composers, but for the
Listening.
for
Yeah.
the two of us, right? And it takes a lot to kind of get yourself into this place where you can sort of appreciate it. And now it's like, I mean, and again, I know I've said these kinds of things on Twitter before, and people get mad at me. They're like, well, I love jazz, and it's like, yeah, no, I know you do. I don't doubt that you do, but it's also incumbent upon us to admit that it is esoteric. It takes a long time to build a structure in which we can inhabit to experience it and appreciate it at its depth.
Yeah. No, I think that all of that is right. Like the psychologization of the person in the novel is
Mm,
so, it's something that I think if you imagine in the ancient world would have just been befuddled, like
yeah,
to
yeah,
see this kind of psychologization of the person. Although it's
hmm
not that there weren't deep psychological insights
right,
even in Homer or
right,
in the ancients,
right.
but this kind of autobiographical,
You know what it is, Jonathan. I think it's as we become less and less of a liturgical people, novels novels drain liturgy in some interesting kind of way because
Mhm.
it's one of the things I love about Shakespeare or Homer is that the language itself is liturgical. And I know like both of us come, we inhabit liturgical traditions. And so, we spend a portion of every week sort of plugging ourselves back into this kairotic I don't want to call it a performance, but like
Yeah,
this kairotic work, right?
yeah,
That as we become more and more and more low as a church, right, broadly understood here, because all of us North Americans, whether we want to admit it or not, are by default low church people. The two of us have to kind of plug ourselves back
yeah,
into high church sensibility. Um, but when you encounter the Iliad or the Odyssey, you see this, you're plugging yourself back into liturgy. And if you even think about the way that an ancient audience would have experienced Homer, it would have been liturgical.
yeah,
There would have been the bard in the front, reciting the litanies and the refrains and all these things. And I do not like when people say, oh, the epithets in Homer are just like memory devices. It's like, no, like I'm it is Alleluia and Amen a memory device? Is thanks be to God a memory device? Well,
yeah,
not really, or not exclusively,
yeah,
and not
yeah, yeah.
only.
Hmm. And so then the question is, in some ways, how do we reintegrate these elements back into, the story? One of the things that I've been been doing, in the fairy tales we're writing is that in
Mm.
some ways I feel like character arcs, for example, that are the kind of superficial, not superficial, but like the most immediate aspect of modern storytelling,
Yes.
that they actually have something that is useful, that something that I think can be carried over, and so going back into the fairy tales and having character coherence, for example, which is something that, the ancient fairy tales maybe didn't care about. Like to ask yourself, like, what's motivating the characters in the way that they're acting, and so trying to kind of integrate that to maintain the fairy tale, but integrate this modern sensibility of motivation and psychological, and so
Yeah.
the question is like, what do you think? How do
Yeah.
we integrate this stuff into the future? How do what
Yeah.
what do you see as the things that we should be doing or that we're moving towards?
I think you're right. I think there's been almost a kind of fetishization of character and psychology over and against story. I was rereading Lewis on stories, his essay or his address on stories, and he's steering it back into this question because I think Lewis is such a fascinating character to me. I'm sorry, because he's one of the few people who could see. Um, I oftentimes think that Lewis's genius was that fairly early on, like the early 1930s, he was able to kind of speed run both modernity and post-modernity. Um, and he recognized that it only ends in the abyss.
Hmm.
And so if you look closely at his own career, um, as an academic, but also as a storyteller, I think he intuited and then did a good job of making sense out of the pitfalls that I think we're acutely feeling, you know, 85, 95 years later. So so I'm a Lewis stan. I love him. I think he's brilliant. And I have to admit that as a young English major and in graduate school, I was a total snot about Lewis. You know,
What do you mean? You're a
I
snob
thought,
like you didn't like him.
yeah, I thought he was unsophisticated. I thought he was kind of like a, and you can see this even now, right? It's the kind of thing that Christians feel safe talking about because, like, Lewis is one of us,
Hmm.
that kind of thing. And so I think I bought into that kind of snobbery about how serious he is. And of course, it was total arrogance on my part because all
Hmm.
you have to do is just pick up a few of his essays, pick up, miracles or I mean, abolition of man. I mean, it's like this is a first rate thinker. He has seen it all. And he has pre-seen it
Yeah.
all in a way that I didn't really appreciate until, gosh, like honestly, less than a decade ago.
Hmm.
So for whatever reason, less than a decade ago, I sort of decided to do a deep dive into Lewis, and I'm ashamed. I have to atone for my snobbery in his regard. But anyway, in On Stories, he talks about the modern fixation on character over and against what he says stories as stories, and
Hmm.
which I think is what you have intuited and grasped with your own project about retelling fairy tales.
Yeah.
um that I mean, how much time should you really spend getting into the inner psychology of Rapunzel?
Yeah.
Well, it's like you could imagine some bad contemporary film on, the adult take on
Yeah.
Rapunzel,
Yeah. Well, I
right?
mean, Into the Woods is basically
Yeah,
like the bottom of that. Yeah.
yeah, right. And it's exactly right. It's a bottom that actually has a floor, right? It's not bottomless. It has a floor, and at the end of the day, it's kind of just not ultimately compelling,
Yeah.
right? That the simplicity of the story actually does this profound work upon the soul
Mm.
that fixating on, who Rapunzel had a crush on. I got making this
Yeah.
up, right?
Whatever. Yeah. Like
Whatever, right?
how she
Or,
felt about her father
why,
or
why
whatever.
does, why does my mom always, make me eat peas? I wish I could eat, whatever. I mean, or, these kinds of things.
Yeah.
Um, it's a false ironic sophistication. That irony was supposed to be revelation, but it is turned into like obfuscation or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and so Lewis, I think, names it. He says, there's a peculiar way in which, I think he says like, a pirate is a pirate and a giant is a giant. In other
Mm.
words, there's something about these creatures that invite you into a kind of depth that a piece of internal monologue just doesn't do.
Yeah, and I think that it's funny because you mentioned how Don Quixote is possibly,
Mhm.
the first novel, and I mean, Don Quixote is a comment.
Yes.
It's a
Yep.
comment on something that was sincere. Like
Yep.
chivalry was
Yep.
a
Yep.
sincere uh, part of society. Like it was a posture and a way
Mhm.
of viewing the world and of viewing relationships. And Don Quixote is it's a comment on that, and so there is this irony that is inscribed in that tradition, and and you see it especially in the 20th century. This kind of this idea of the, this notion that we always have to suspect the forthright
Yeah.
the forthright,
Right.
let's say, attitudes of people, that there's always some secret intention behind that. There's a deep psychology, there's trauma, there's
And
all
it's
these things.
twisted, right? And it's a twisted psychology, right?
Yeah.
Right. Because I think, Lewis as a great medievalist, would recognize that, the power of allegory, right? That in other words, you do kind of hide in the story, but what you're hiding in the story seems to be of a different nature or quality than what a modern or contemporary novel, hides.
Yeah. Well, ultimately, what you want in the allegory is more like an analogy. At least that's the way that
Yes,
I
yes.
see it.
Yeah, yeah. No, right. I think that I don't want to pick a fight with Tolkien. Um, but I keep doing this to you. But I think his, sort of broadside against allegory has been really misunderstood.
Yeah, I think it's misunderstood too. I
Like
think that
woefully.
he sees it. I think that the way that he criticizes symbolism, for example, is actually how I view symbolism. That
Yeah.
is,
Right.
he says my stories are applicable.
Right.
And
Right.
so what it is that there's a deep structural analogy in his work, and then you can apply it to the world. It's not like the hobbits mean this,
Right.
the
Right. Right.
king
Right.
means
Right.
this.
Right.
It's more of this deep structural. And in some ways, I think that he actually had a very deep understanding of story in that sense. And I think that's what fairy tales are, by the way, that it's not that, you could say, like if you look at the coming of age aspect of the princesses,
Yeah.
like of Snow White, you say,
Mhm.
well, is it about sex? And the
Right.
answer is, well, it can be applied to sex.
Right. Right.
Is it about growing up and taking responsibility? And so, yeah. Is it about finding love? Like, it's like all of these elements of the story can be then applied to your life and applied to people's lives, but they're not. It's not like, if you say, well, when she let's say when Sleeping Beauty pricks her finger, is that her loss of virginity? Is it her menstruation? So it's neither of those. It's her pricking her finger on a spindle. Can it
Right.
be? Is there an analogy to those other things? Well, yes, of course
Of
there are.
course. Yeah.
And so that's the way. That's the way in which I think that
Yeah.
hope. Like my sense is that. I mean, my sense is that in some ways is the future of. Like in some way, it seems to me like that's the future of storytelling for us now. As we kind of exit this long, and like I can, if I think of the French novels, like, dude, I will never read Balzac. Like, I'm not going
Right.
to read these
Right.
people. Like, it's just not
Right.
going to happen.
Right.
So,
Right.
anyways, that's my.
And you know what, and like that's okay, right? I think I subscribe to a kind of living notion of tradition, right? And there are times where novels go away, or stories, sorry, everything, they go away and they kind of come back. And I think that that's fine. Right. I don't want to set up a kind of house of bones in which we, these are the 36, real ones. So I do think that there's a kind of fluid quality to the patrimony, that there are times and places for these things. Just like, look, I'm sure you've had this experience where, you picked up a book in the last couple of years that you didn't terribly care for when you were 20, and you read it now, you're like, oh, and so for whatever reason, it now resonates with you. And so I think we can understand that in a bigger sense.